Good morning and welcome to another online Sunday school class with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. As always, we like to begin by reminding you that we here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church believe that Jesus is the Christ, that He is the Son of the living God who lived a perfect life and died a sacrificial death for your sins and for mine, and that if you will place your hope and trust in Jesus Christ as both Lord and Savior, that you'll be saved. If you would like more information about what it means to make Jesus Christ your Lord and Savior, we would invite you to follow the link in our description that will take you to a full gospel presentation. It'll also show you how to respond to the gospel and how to connect with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. If you live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we would invite you to join us for worship at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings, both in person and online through Facebook Live. If you do not live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we still want to connect with you and help you find a Bible-believing church where you do live. As we get into our study today, we are going to be on session 11, which is titled Trust Exhibited. And we're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 6, verses 10 through 24. So again, this is session 11, titled Trust Exhibited, and looking at Daniel chapter 6, verses 10 through 24. And as we begin in our study, I want us to begin to think about just some of the benefits of walking with God for a while. Maybe you are a Christian who has been serving the Lord and faithful to a church family and just walking with God for a while, and you're thinking about some of those benefits. Maybe you're a new Christian and you're still learning about the benefits that come with walking with the Lord and trusting in Him, but you have those seasoned veterans in your life that are helping you walk through that. And one of the things you'll notice is that as you begin to walk with the Lord, and especially as the maturity begins to increase and you are surrounding yourself with people who maybe are discipling you and helping you in that endeavor, one of the things you're going to start noticing is how time and time again God proves that His word is true, and that you can trust Him, and that you can put your faith in Him, and that you can count on Him no matter what, and that even sometimes when the whole world says something is wrong, what we begin to notice is that when we look to the Scriptures and we place our faith and our hope in God, that we can have confidence in knowing that the Bible is right about everything, and that God is right about everything. And I say all of this to ask this question, and it's this: in what areas of life do you find it most difficult to trust God? And what does trusting God look like? So here's what we want you to do. We want you to take some time and really process the questions that we ask through the course of this video. So we want you to pause the video. If you're watching this by yourself, get a pen, get some paper, and actually interact back with us. In fact, maybe if you're going to continue to watch these videos, get a notebook and turn it into my online Sunday school class notebook, and write down the questions and then write down the answers after each session, and have that interaction. If you're watching this with your family, maybe you're home because of the pandemic and you're watching with your wife and your family, we would encourage you to pause that video, have that discussion, and in both cases, whenever you're ready, to just hit play again, and we'll continue on in the study. Let me ask that question again. It's this: in what areas of life do you find it most difficult to trust God? And what does trusting God even look like? Take a couple minutes to discuss that, and then whenever you're ready, hit play again, and we'll continue on in our study. All right, hopefully you've had some good discussion about that. That is a very much so a wide open question for you, and really for me also. I know when I think of some of the areas that I have the hardest time trusting God in, one area, if I'm being really honest, is going to be my family. Not that I am overly controlling and all that, but I am a protective father, and I do want to know that my children are safe and secure. And one of the hardest areas for me is to just rest in God's promises and trust in Him is in the safety and security of my kids. I want to make sure that I know my kids are safe. And what I'm learning is that the older I get, the harder it is for me to know and to be confident in my children's security. And so in those areas, I have to learn to trust the Lord and trust that He is going to take care of my kids even better than I could possibly hope to. As we get into the book of Daniel, we're going to notice that he is transitioning in his ministry role, and things are going to change. Now, Daniel, up to this point in our study, has been working with a king named King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. But what we are going to begin to notice is that now things are changing. In fact, Babylon is no more, and Persia has now come onto the scene and taken over, that Daniel has shifted from being the advisor to Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. There's been another king, and now we find him working with a new king, and a king named Darius. And Darius is connected to Persia and to the Medes, and he's going to find himself in a new situation. Now, what's happened is Daniel was once an advisor and technically considered kind of the head of the magicians under Nebuchadnezzar, and now he finds himself as in this kind of elevated position where he is a leader or administrator over all of these different regions. What King Darius had done is he had put governors and regional people all throughout the kingdom of Persia, and then those people had people over them, and then those people had people over them, and then that last group of only 3 people, those were the ones that answered directly to the king and really became kind of those close advisors to the king. So Daniel is one of 3 of those people. And in this position, he is a Jew. He was one that was in exile. He is obviously different from them and faithful to the one God of Israel, as opposed to the many gods that we might find in Babylon or Persia or Mede or any of the other nations around them. And because of this begins to put him in a very interesting spot about how to be a good administrator to the king while also being a faithful follower of the one true God. And with all this in mind, we're going to get into our study today and see how these people set out to get rid of Daniel. And that's exactly what happens as we jump into chapter 6 of the book of Daniel. What we see happening here is these people that are under Daniel and the people that are kind of even with Daniel, they all kind of decide that they don't really like Daniel. They don't like him. Maybe it's because of his ethnicity. Maybe it's because of his worship of the one true God. Maybe it's because of the fact that he really was even kind of the one closest to King Darius. Darius trusted him and he had confidence in him, and so he kind of looked to him more than maybe anyone else, and there was envy involved in all of this. And so they had an idea. They went to the king and they made a suggestion to the king, and they said, "Hey, king, let's make an edict, let's make a rule that for the next 30 days, no one can pray to any god or ask for anything apart from talking to you." And so this would outlaw prayer, this would outlaw making petitions or requests, that the only person that anybody could go to for the next 30 days is to the king himself in order to have their wishes fulfilled or in order to make any kind of petition. Well, this seemed quite safe to King Darius. He didn't understand that there was an angle being played here, and so he agreed to it. And by agreeing, he signed the edict. It became official law. It was a 30-day thing, but these people had ulterior motives in store for them because they knew that Daniel was faithful to the one true God, and as a faithful follower of Yahweh, he had a routine and a habit of praying to Yahweh 3 times a day. And as he would pray to them, he would go to his room, as was normally his custom, and he would pray. But now they had outlawed this practice, and that they knew that if Daniel were to continue in the way that he had prior to this edict being declared, that he would find himself in a place of trouble. And that's exactly where we pick up in Daniel chapter 6. And we're going to read Daniel chapter 6, verses 10 through 14. And I want you, as we read this together, to take special note of Daniel's decision when faced with the choice of petitioning God or petitioning the king alone. Daniel chapter 6, picking up in verse 10, we read this. When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, this is the law that had been declared, he went into his house, into the windows in the upstairs room open towards Jerusalem. And 3 times a day he got down on his knees, prayed, and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring to God. And so they approached the king and asked about the edict. "Didn't you sign an edict that for 30 days any person who petitions any god or man except you, the king will be thrown into the lion's den?" The king answered, "It is the law of the Medes and the Persians. The order stands and is irrevocable." And they replied to the king, "Daniel, one of the Judean exiles, has ignored you, the king, and the edict you signed, for he had prayed 3 times a day. And as soon as the king heard this, he was very displeased, and he set his mind on rescuing Daniel and made every effort until sundown to deliver him. Now, this is a really fascinating passage because it tells us a little bit about his accusers. It tells us a little bit about Daniel, and it tells us a little bit about the king. And this seems to be very different than what we usually experience when we read about persecution and some of the challenges and the different ways that God has showed up for his people and for the nation of Israel. So what we see right off the bat is Daniel continues on in his faithful prayer. What's interesting to note in this passage is that he says that it says that he continued to pray as he always had. It's important to note that in this passage, and it's something I think that we should take to heart, is that because of this new law, he didn't set out to do something to really put on a show, to show his disapproval of the law. This was not a form of protest or anything like that. There was no showmanship to what Daniel was doing. Rather, Daniel learned of the edict, understood what was happening, and basically his very simple response was, I'm going to keep doing what I've always done. And that's exactly what he does. His faithfulness, even faced with execution, is a testimony to his confidence in God no matter what came down the line. And so we see this tremendous faithfulness with Daniel that really should communicate to us what it means to be faithful as well. The book puts it this way. It says, civil government being ordained by God, it is the duty of Christians to render loyal obedience thereto at all things, not contrary to the revealed will of God. Essentially what that is saying is this: we as Christians, and what we see exemplified in Daniel's life was we are to be obedient to the laws of the country that we live in, and understand that even ruling governments, civil governments, whether it's the local, the state, or the national government, is something that God has put there and put in place, that is allowed to be there, and that we are called to be obedient to the government so long as it does not violate the express commands, the clear commands of God in other areas. So in the case of Daniel, he was obedient to the law in almost every respect, but to this one law, he could not remain faithful to God and be obedient to the government at the same time, and so he made the choice to be obedient to God. This leaves us with a question that I would like you to pause the video and write down your thoughts on, or have a discussion on, which is this: where is the line for believers when it comes to ignoring or knowingly disobeying laws that restrict religious freedom? So this is a question I want you to ask, and let's really think about this and maybe even come up with some examples. The passage says, the thing that was written by the book is that we're supposed to follow the laws of our land until it very clearly violates what we're supposed to do, our obedience to God. Where is that line? Take a couple minutes to discuss that as you see things happening in your life, as you hear stories throughout maybe persecution of the church throughout history, or even in today's time. Where do you think that line needs to be drawn, and what is kind of the consequences thereof? Take a couple minutes, discuss that, and then we'll continue on in our study. All right, hopefully you've had some good conversation about that, or some good thoughts on that. If we were trying to give some examples of where we draw that line, I think we could look even to the pandemic a little bit to kind of get an idea for that. Should we do things like social distance, or wear masks, or have hand sanitizer and all those things available in our church? Yeah, I think those are perfectly good and safe things. I think we should encourage that. If we see the government singling out churches as a group that should not be meeting and should not be coming together for worship or any such thing, and yet is allowing other things to take place, the classic line, if I can go to Walmart or a movie theater or the grocery store or to a concert, but I can't go to church and worship, then something is clearly wrong there. And I think that when it comes to something like gathering together of the church as the church body, I think we should understand that, consequences come what may, we should gather as the church to worship God. So that may be one line that I would draw, is that the government should never tell the church not to gather. So that could be, and even within that, I think some wisdom can be applied. It's interesting here because we see the faithfulness of Daniel, and then we also have this group of people that are clearly out to get Daniel, so much so that they knew his habit. I truly believe that they knew that he went into his home, that he went to a certain window, that he prayed towards Jerusalem 3 times a day. I think they knew that about him. He probably excused himself from the king's court multiple times, 3 times every day in order to go do this. And so in one of those times when they did that, we see them gather together and then go after him. They wanted to have many witnesses. They wanted there to be no shadow of a doubt that that Daniel was violating the law that the king had signed. Then to make things more interesting is we have the king, and the king initially signs this edict, this law, and sees no problem with it. But what we learn from the passage is that he's actually not happy about it. There's 2 interesting things about King Darius that I want to point out. One is we recognize that King Darius is subject to his own laws. With Nebuchadnezzar, I really don't feel like that was the case. I think that Nebuchadnezzar felt like no matter what he said, no matter what he did, that the government existed upon his whim and that he didn't need to worry about in a situation like this, because if he said, well, but I like Daniel, so he's acquitted, there would have been no problem. But Darius was clearly subject to kind of a higher law of the culture, which brings out this concept of, according to the laws of Persia and the Medes, that whatever law is taken is put in place, it cannot be revoked. So even Darius was kind of subject to this higher arching law, and then with that is the recognize that he realized he'd been tricked. He realized that these people had really truly set out to get Daniel, and this law that he thought was harmless and maybe just kind of something to kind of show and exemplify his greatness was actually a means by which these other people had sought to get Daniel, who was someone he cared about and he loved, even to the point of wanting to try and find a way to get around the law and ultimately spare Daniel. Daniel's continued service to God sets an example to us and to others. The book also asks this question. It says, would you consider the decree more of a trap for Daniel or for Darius? So even just given the information I've told you today and how we're both being disrespected by the officials. So let's take a couple minutes in light of what I've just said and kind of your own thoughts. Take a moment to read the passage again. Do you think this was a trap more for Daniel or for Darius, and how were both men disrespected by the officials? Take a couple minutes to discuss that, and then we'll read our next passage. All right. I mean, I think obviously the answer to that is really both. I think that the intention of the other people, the satraps and the other officials, was to get Daniel. Their focus was on trapping and snagging Daniel. However, having said that, I think what ultimately happens is, while Daniel seems to not, throughout all of this, he never speaks out on his own behalf. He never argues it. He never denies it. In fact, through the whole process, not one time do we ever hear Daniel make any defense for himself. However, what we do see is that the king is upset about what happens and is seeking that way to kind of to thwart their plans and to get around the law. And so ultimately what I think is, even though this was a trap intended for Daniel, and Daniel is certainly going to ultimately kind of reap the punishment for it, that it's actually the king who feels tricked, who feels like he has been manipulated, and that's going to play into the story later. Let's keep going, and let's look at Daniel verses 15 through 18. And as we've kind of already talked about Darius's kind of feeling of being tricked and his desire to try and find a way around the law, we're going to see more about how King Darius acts towards Daniel in this whole situation. Picking up in verse 15, we read this. Then these men went together to the king and said, "You know, your majesty, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no edict or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed." So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel, and they threw him into the lion's den. And the king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you." And the stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet ring of the nobles, so that nothing in regard to Daniel could be changed. Then the king went to the palace and spent the night fasting, and no diversions were brought to him, but he could not sleep. What we see in this passage is this continued behavior towards the whole situation. The king acting very different, not aloof and disinterested in the whole situation, but deeply invested and emotional towards it. The books ask this question. I think it's something I want to discuss together. It says, what is the significance of no recorded words being attributed to Daniel in response to the charges or the sentences? That's an interesting fact, something that we've already thought about, we've already talked about, but it's important to note that Daniel doesn't deny what he did. I think this is an interesting point when we think about Christianity and persecution of Christianity and even civil disobedience within Christianity. Daniel defies the edict and the law of the king, knowing that the penalty for it would be death. And in the midst of all that, he defies it, and he never denies it. He never tries to hide it. He just does it. And then when consequences come as a result of it, he basically just says, yeah, I'm aware of what the law says. I have to be faithful to God and not just obedient to the king. And so if this is the consequence for my faithfulness to God, then come what may. And I think that's the proper response for the Christian as well. When we find ourselves in a situation where we do have to make a choice between being obedient to the law of the land or being obedient to Christ, I think we choose to be obedient to the Word, be obedient to God, obedient to Christ, but with the understanding that we don't hide it. Now, we can use good wisdom in that. Like, I think when we're talking about persecuted Christians and persecuted countries who are meeting in secret and all that stuff, I think that's perfectly fine. But when we are obedient to God, we are obedient to God. And if we are arrested for it, if we find ourselves in chains or in prison or whatever, we take the punishment. We don't lie. We don't deny. We don't create conflict and allow for innocent people to be hurt. When it comes to us, what do we say for ourselves? We say, I have made a commitment to follow Jesus, and I will follow the Lord even if it means I have to be disobedient to the laws of man, and then we take the punishment, whatever it may be. There's several unusual actions by the king, and through all of this, first off, he acknowledges the God of Daniel, and he tells Daniel that he hopes that his God, the one that he faithfully serves, will be one that ultimately delivers him. We see that he does seal up the thing. He does stay true to the law and what he's done. But because of that, he doesn't eat. He doesn't, they use this term, he doesn't ask for diversions. We could have a whole conversation about what that means. But essentially that evening, he spent the evening by himself. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat in fear and worry that his advisor and his friend, someone that he admired and respected, had been sentenced to death. And we see again that even though that it is Daniel who's the one being thrown into the lion's den, it is King Darius that feels duped, feels betrayed, and has a deep concern and respect and admiration for Daniel. The book asks this question. I wanted to ask it to you. Is this: what actions could the king have taken? And what do the actions that he took reveal about his understanding of God and prayer? So take a couple minutes, discuss that, and then we will return to our study. All right, it's so interesting to see how, even though the king followed through with the execution, how upset he was by it. To be honest, the king could have said, well, he's a goner, and there's not much point worrying about him anymore, and gone on to celebrate or maybe even have a party to kind of honor his death, kind of a wake, if you will. He could have taken advantage of all those distractions that were at his service. He could have drank himself into stupor and had no hope or thought that there was any chance for Daniel whatsoever. But instead we see him deeply grieved. And he fasts, which seems to be an act of not only concern but submission to God. He hopes that Daniel will be delivered, and there's almost this idea that he is recognizing that if the God of Daniel is true, like he has already heard and probably knows about the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and so on and so forth, there is a hope deep inside the heart of King Darius, even though he may not have been a person who really feared the Lord, that there is a chance that maybe, just maybe, Daniel would survive. The book goes on to point out a very interesting thing, is that there's a very clearer comparison between Jesus and Daniel. We see that Jesus was also betrayed and given a mockery of a trial, even though what he had done was really not bad, and he was accused by people that were his enemies, just like Daniel did. We see that Jesus did not raise up a voice in his defense, did not call them unjust or unfair in all of these things, just like Daniel. One of the most striking things in our passage is the fact that while Daniel goes into the lion's den, a stone is rolled in front of the mouth of the den, and it is sealed with the king's signet. In the same way, Jesus, after he has been crucified, his body is placed in a tomb, that a stone is rolled over it, and again also it is sealed by the temple guard to see to it that no one opens the tomb. There are so many ways that we see how Daniel might even be a type or something pointing to the very thing that we are going to see from Christ himself, right down to the fact that in anybody else's mind, the crucifixion, beyond a shadow of a doubt, means death, and death is permanent. Same with the tomb. So too, to be thrown into the lion's den and to have the tomb sealed should be a sign of certain death, and that Daniel would be gone forever. The book says this, it says, Jesus assured his followers that they would face persecution in the world. However, he told them that they should not fear because he had overcome the world. The same God who would rise Jesus from the grave is the same God who would shut the mouths of the lions. And let's read that right now. Daniel chapter 6, picking up in verse 19, we read these words. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the king of the living God, the king said, has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions? Then Daniel spoke to the king, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions, and they haven't harmed me, for I was found innocent before him, and also before you, your majesty, for I have not done harm. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to take Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was brought up from the den, he was found to be unharmed, for he had trusted in his God. And the king then gave command, and that those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the lion's den, and their children and their wives. And they did not even reach the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all of their bones. A tremendous example and a powerful thing that we can look at this. We're revealed yet again that King Darius had this deep concern for Daniel, that he cared about him. One of the things the book pointed out that I thought was interesting was that it's unclear whether Darius, when he got there, really thought he would hear Daniel call back to him, or if his crying out in anguish was just a cry out like, oh, Daniel, Daniel, did he save you? Did anything? And he thought for sure that he would hear nothing out from the den. But back from the den, he maybe fully intended to look down into the lion's den and just see cloth and blood and maybe just the last few remnants of his friend and his advisor. But instead of all of these things, he heard Daniel's voice cry back. And what a powerful and wonderful thing. I cannot even imagine how elated Darius would have been to realize that the God that Daniel served faithfully had indeed delivered him. Now, Daniel makes an interesting point about this, is when he says, the God whom I serve has sent an angel, that he shut the mouths of the lions because I am innocent before God, just like I am innocent before you. He points to the fact that God, that even though the law had declared him guilty, and even though the law had said that he had to be killed, he had to be thrown in the lion's den, that God, the creator of the earth, that the Most High, had actually declared him to be innocent. Daniel was brought out of the den unharmed as a demonstration of the virtue before the Lord and before the king. Daniel's accusers thought they were getting rid of him, but God intervened, and what actually happened is that Daniel was not harmed, but they, in fact, met their own demise. When God, one of the things that we can learn from all this is that God does protect his servants, but that is not always the case. It is interesting to note that even though in this passage we see how God delivered Daniel from the mouths of the lions and that he eventually put him back to his place, but we also recognize that throughout Scripture we see other stories of other situations. We look to the New Testament in the book of Acts. We see both Stephen, who was ultimately stoned to death for his faithful witness to the Lord. The first apostle to be martyred was James. We know throughout the history that there have been many who have ultimately given their lives for the sake of the gospel and for the sake of Christ. And we have to remember that sometimes God is glorified in the delivering of people like Daniel, but sometimes God is glorified in the martyrdom of those who are willing to pay the ultimate price to see the gospel proclaimed. This leads us to our final question of the day, and one I want you to ponder. I want you to write some things down, have this discussion, close your time in prayer, and then join us for worship at 11 o'clock. That question is this. It says this: how does God vindicate His faithful followers through both sparing their lives and through their death? So how does God use both the sparing of lives like we see in Daniel and the ultimate martyrdom of those who ultimately give their lives like James and Stephen? How does God use both of those for His kingdom and for His glory and for the furthering of the gospel? Take a couple minutes, discuss that, write some things down, close your time in prayer, and then join us for worship at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings right here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. You can do that in person, also online through Facebook Live. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you're doing well. God bless.